this concept that within Google, we talked about constraint breeds creativity. The same applies to all early stage startups of, well, you have to bootstrap, you're usually forced to. But some of the most innovative solutions I saw came from in very emerging markets where there simply was no other option, or you're solving a tangible problem. I mean, you work with Charity Water, for example, right? Some of these are life and death situations where, well, we have to use technology somehow to innovate. And so I had spent a lot of time before we started Google for Entrepreneurs, Google for Startups, in working on Central Asia, Middle East. We had an effort within Google that was called the Bottom 20 internally, which was the 20 least connected countries in the world from an access perspective. And could we, send in a cross-functional team for a week or so, meet as many potential partner organizations as we could, come home and launch products and partnerships.
Mary, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, look, so we've had some overlap. You were at Google for 15 years, I think, and I was there for 7.5. And even though we were different offices and regions, I don't think we actually physically overlapped. But we definitely had some overlapping work with Google for Entrepreneurs, which you were leading for a long time and started. So we're going to dig into a little bit of your experience there today. And nowadays you're also investing, and you've got quite a unique approach to how you're investing. So we're going to be digging into that thesis as well today. But before we do that, why don't you just take me back to 2004? It was your first day at Google. It was pre-IPO, right? So take me back to that moment. Like, what was going on at that time? Where were you in your life, and what led you to Google at that point?
Thank you for that intro, and again for having me. Gosh, back to 2004, it was quite an exciting time. So I had, just to back it up a bit further, I come from a very scrappy immigrant entrepreneurial family. So my parents were immigrants from Thailand who met here in America, built and ran a variety of small businesses, primarily in healthcare for over 30 years. And so I grew up with that mindset, ended up pretty serendipitously at Stanford for undergrad and grad school. And so it was a serendipitous, almost accident that I ended up in the tech industry. But, a much lesser known at the time company, much smaller company named Google, was recruiting on campus. And one thing led to another. And so I started in July of 2004. So just before the IPO. And I had an ambition of going to law school at the time. So joined pretty much immediately after graduation. I moved into an apartment, started at Google for the adventure of a lifetime. I thought it was going to be a 1-year stint and ended up being 15, as you noted. Just amazing years, part of that chapter. So I began working in the legal department, specifically on the IPO deal team, which was a pretty exhilarating experience for somebody totally fresh and green and new in their career, new to corporate life, new to startup life. You may laugh that I use the word startup, but remember that Google at that time was 2,000 people globally. When I left in 2018, we were more than 100,000 people. So it's just a wild ride.
That's wild. Yeah. So, and you worked on the actual IPO deal, right? So like that must have been a pretty cool experience to be there for that big IPO. Like what's that like? Because a lot of people listening to the show dream of one day taking a company public or being part of a company that does that. So like, do you remember much about that time?
I remember a lot about that time. It was really exciting. There was a small core team from inside Google, and of course, our outside counsel and outside the bankers and whatnot. But a lot of it was internal to the company as far as preparing, and so it was thrilling. There's just the way that Google chose to go public as well through the Dutch auction model, and the notion again of democratizing. The word democratizing comes up a lot, I think, within the context of Google, democratizing access to buy into the IPO. And so it was an amazing time. It was, 2004. And if you think about it, that was the time when I remember Gmail was just in beta, and it was a huge deal to get an invite. And then to be able to
it was the hot invite.
Exactly. The 10 family and friends invites that you got. This was pre, Google Docs, G Suite, that entire product suite. At the time, we used AOL Instant Messenger inside the company,
That's
believe it or
hilarious.
not. And it was my college screen name
What,
that we
Mary,
were using.
what was your screen name? Do you remember?
My actually funny, I haven't thought of it until this moment, but it was California Malini because
Oh,
Malini
that's hilarious.
is my Thai name, my middle name, California Malini. Uh, I think it was because I had moved to New York or whatnot, but yeah, it's this big inflection point for the company, and then it became a question of what happens next. And for me, we went public soon after I had joined, so I spent that first year in the legal team, got to rotate through various teams, work on some of the early public company compliance work, and then ultimately realized that I had fallen in love with the company, with the product, the vision, what was happening on the product and business side. And I was very fortunate early on to just be surrounded by some really extraordinary people who were much more senior to me, who took me under their wing, formally or informally. People like Megan Smith, who was a phenomenal leader at Google, now went on to be President Obama's CTO, now is running her own company. But I next went to work for Megan on a team that was at the time called New Business Development, and essentially was a catch-all for almost everything that was non-product and engineering. So thinking about partnering essentially as the first business partner to Google product and eng teams to license content, work on distribution deals, help open up new markets, patent cross-licensing, like really truly a wide array of new business development, so to speak. So I had the opportunity to do that for 6 years, which brought me to New York to help expand our team in New York. It then brought me to Zurich, which is the Google headquarters for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and grow that work there. So it really, for me, opened up that next chapter within a chapter, if you will.
Yeah, that must have been crazy amount of change in such a short amount of time. Is Zurich is the one with the famous slide, right?
The famous slide, among many other things. It's a super international office, given the friendliness towards allowing international work visas. There was such an extraordinary amount of diversity in that office, and it was a really, really cool place to be.
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like we're in 2021 and people have seen startups for the last 10 years with ping pong tables and kombucha on tap and all those things, but people forget like 2004, 2005, even 2010 when I started, that wasn't especially in Europe, because I started in Dublin, which became the EMEA headquarters as an operational place anyway, and that wasn't the culture, right? Like when I was graduating, most of my friends were trying to get into consulting and finance, and you're expected to wear a tie and a very different kind of environment. So I think people now are kind of used to it because we've kind of been doing that for so long. But at the time, it was quite revolutionary, and getting free meals and all that sort of stuff. Let's talk a little bit about your time at Google, because not many people I interview have actually directly worked with people like Larry and Sergey and Eric Schmidt and the exec team that you mentioned, and others. What changed after the IPO? Because again, this is different for each company, of course, but Google is a once in a generation company, and so much must have changed straight after that. So were there a few things that you noticed as you went public, like the culture changed or just the pace of things changed?
I would answer that actually the opposite way, and it's what didn't change. And that's what was important, right? Was we had this beautiful culture that to me is so synonymous with how I think about Silicon Valley, which is we talk all the time internally about what does it mean to be googly, right? And you're smiling as I say that, because, and I think it means different things to different people, but the essence of it is this spirit of transparency, of communication, of collaboration, of 10x thinking, of rolling up the sleeves, of running hard, of trying to operate at scale, billions of people scale from day one with everything you do. The opportunity to operate at that scale is something that it's incredibly addictive, and it's hard to, your brain gets wired a certain way, which is an incredible gift. But to me, what was amazing about the early culture and the days of, we had the tradition the TGIF tradition, which was that everybody in the company gathered as an all hands. Used to be Friday afternoons, then became Thursday afternoons, and then became,
Because people had families and other stuff to do on Fridays.
yep. And because we're such a global team, and what about Asia? What about EMEA? And so moving that to Thursday as well. But in the beginning, we had 3 buildings. Google campus was 3 buildings when I started. One cafe, one gym, you had the campus feel, everything that you could possibly need. But as we scaled globally, there was something so unique about the culture. And it was the idea that you share openly, you have access to information, whether or not you're working on it. Pretty much anyone could raise their hand to work on a project or a team if you just took the initiative and were willing to take it on in addition to your core. In my experience, the answer was always yes. It was a place where you didn't wait to ask to be granted permission. It was you sought out, for the scrappy go-getter, it's the perfect environment. And so that didn't change to me. And I was, the next chapter of my time at Google was building Google for Entrepreneurs, which is now Google for Startups. And that experience put me on the ground in at least 40 countries for Google. And I can tell you that there was something so intrinsically unifying about the culture in each place. And so to me, I'd answer the question of, yes, we grew. Yes, we scaled. Yes, there were more operational processes in place. Yes, there became layers and some, necessary bureaucracy that comes with that. But that culture didn't change. And I was just so proud to be a part of that and to see that now that I've left Google, right, from the outside perspective, it'll always remain just this really special chapter with really special people.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's really cool, because I'm thinking even from my time early on, someone asked me this in another podcast I do about like how it changed over time. So I left in 2017. So when I joined, there were maybe 18,000 people. It went to 85 when I left. And there's good and bad with that, like you said, right? Like there's the expanded scope of the company. Like it went from just a search company to all types of advertising, to YouTube and Chrome and Android and all the fun stuff that you probably worked on. And of course, there's the downsides as well. So I'm curious from your point of view, as you navigated throughout getting the next job and the next job, like what were some of the things you were thinking through to figure out your next step? Because everyone listening to this is experiencing that in their own ways, in their own careers or business. And I'm not saying give advice necessarily, but how was that for you personally?
Like many of the best things in my life, they were unplanned. And that's ironic because I'm very much a planner, and I think I'm myself as hyper organized, and I've got a plan. But realistically, I never, and I told you, I started at Google with the intention of spending 1 year on the way to law school. I had 3 very different roles that were 3 very different chapters, almost to the point where it could have been different companies. It just allowed with me to bring with me the bench of experiences and relationships on to the next one. And so that's one observation is, even though it doesn't mean that you're not wildly ambitious and a planner, but be open-minded about what might be staring at you in the face, because the best roles in my mind, they haven't necessarily been created yet, or they can be created even in the context of a very large company. So that's one. The other is, if you are at a large company right now and worried about, is there room to be innovative? 100%, I think the answer is yes. And it's carving out that window, piloting something, proving it through data, hopefully growing it. And so, but it's always been very much about being willing to take a total risk. And it might not sound like a risk because, hey, you're already working at Google, but both big leaps that I made were, to me, represented really big risks and big question marks. And I would say were, among the very best decisions I've ever made.
Were there decisions you made throughout your career, whether it was changing jobs or, hiring people obviously is kind of a different thing. So maybe we'll get to that after, but more so navigating the jobs and the roles, and maybe even beyond Google, where you felt like you maybe made mistakes and you said, okay, well, I thought it was going to be this one thing and it ended up not being what I thought out. And maybe that didn't mean you fell flat on your face, but it wasn't necessarily what you planned.
For me, I really thrive on ambiguity, which means I enjoy situations that are not super defined and a little bit unbounded. And I'm okay with that uncertainty. And it's sort of new business development was that in the sense of, well, it's a new team. We don't know the direction that Google products will go. You're going to help be a part of, figuring out the business side of it. Google for Startups was similar, which was literally our executive team gave me the opportunity and said, we have so many different organic nascent efforts around the company that deal with startups and entrepreneurs, because at heart, Google, intrinsic to Google is this belief that, we want to support the next generation and entrepreneurship's part of the DNA. But would you like to experiment with, we've never had a dedicated team budget or headcount to actually build something proactive. And the conversation was literally, this may fail. It may not even be a full-time job. Do you want to do it? And the answer was yes. So I think less that it wasn't what I expected it to be. It was more that I didn't have a full picture of what it could be. And so, but where there's been challenges for sure. I mean, I think, in a large organization, the biggest learning for me was just open, transparent, pretty much over communication and understanding your stakeholders, your adjacent teams, who you could go the extra mile to be respectful toward, just to loop them in. And, you start to get a lot of overlapping efforts in whatever the sector may be. And so I think just trying to be a unifier internally while you're focused on execution externally.
Yeah, and I'm going to bring up something quite specific to Google, since we both work there, and I'm sure this is similar in other companies, especially big companies by this point. But I mean, half my closest friends are still at Google, so I meet them every week and I get to hear all the ins and outs of what's going on. Sure. And one thing that I kind of always hear from them, and it's probably been the case for some time, is I don't meet that many people that are like super satisfied with all parts of the job. And of course, maybe that's because maybe there isn't a perfect job, and maybe it's an expectation thing. But what I found is a lot of people who end up staying for a certain amount of time kind of hit a ceiling, and that doesn't mean just in terms of levels and pay and stuff like that, but more so in what their capabilities are. And I don't want to speak for everyone, but even I'll just use myself as an example. I got to a certain point where I thought, okay, I could keep getting paid more and I can play the game and go up levels and find another role. But I felt like I eventually had to leave to really fulfill my potential, in air quotes, of being an independent entrepreneur, someone who wanted to create stuff, work in smaller companies. So I'm curious for you, what was that turning point for you where you realized after 15 years of, so many different roles that you were ready to move on? And were there questions you were asking yourself to kind of gauge that when the time was right?
Absolutely. No, it's a great observation that, even though I felt like, yes, there were these 3 distinct roles, different skill sets, different chapters, ultimately it was all my career to date had been entirely at Google. And I did feel that I constantly pushed myself to answer the question internally to me, is when is the last time you were really scared and really out of your comfort zone and really uncomfortable? And, I didn't have a good answer to that. And the intellectual curiosity that Google satisfies is tremendous. But I like you, felt like, I've been working for over a decade at this point, working on community building, supporting ecosystems, supporting entrepreneurs. It's time to go and be one, and walk that path directly. And my approach to that was building a firm to invest and back entrepreneurs and support them. So it's an intersection of those exact skill sets, plus needing to build it from the ground up and sink or swim on your own, which is really exciting. And to think about doing that outside of a world-known platform, like with the Google brand behind it, right? It is scary and it's exciting. And I applaud you and, so many of our former colleagues and current friends have gone down such wildly interesting paths. And I think it was the best training ground that I could have asked for this next step.
Let's touch a little bit on Google for Startups. it was called Google for Entrepreneurs, and then eventually became Google for Startups, right? So from what I could see, there were more than 50 hubs around the world. You supported over 400,000 entrepreneurs and people who'd be a part of those hubs. Like, what was the vision for Google for Startups in the first place? Like, what was the point of it for Google to be involved in this space?
To me, it was one of the most forward-leaning approaches for our senior executive team at Google to be willing to invest heavily in startup ecosystems around the world without a direct mandate for financial return, right? And it was not, to be clear, it was definitely not in the philanthropic charitable bucket. It was coming out of Google Inc. in the bottom line. But the idea was, if we invest and create this platform, more startups created, more jobs created, more companies coming online, down the road will lead to direct utilization and monetization for Google's core business. And so that's a pretty unique approach. Anytime any corporation has initiatives to support startups, I get excited, but that unique approach was really killer. And so the first year, the first conversation that we had, and I mentioned, like, hey, you could pilot this, may or may not be a full-time thing, maybe it doesn't work out. So I created within a few days the first pitch, and it was this slide that had Google in the middle, and then all the different branches of the ecosystem that we could work with, from universities to accelerators to co-working spaces to startups directly to the policy public sector sphere, and just a broad vision for what our role could be in terms of convening, in terms of financially supporting. And I knew that any vision to be truly googly had to be both direct, meaning we work directly with startups, but also through partnerships to achieve that potential for billions of users at scale. And so my first pitch was for $10 million for the first year for a budget and 3 headcount. And the answer was, great, go, let's try it out. And so that was 2011. And the team has really just grown. It's such a passionate, talented group, and I'm still really close with I consider everybody their family. And just to see the direction that they've taken it in the past few years, some of the new initiatives out of the US, for example, the Black Founders Fund, the very targeted range of accelerator programs that are able to directly reach even more startups, the growth of the campus footprint and the partnership footprint. And so, yes, that was always the model, was sort of B2B and B2C, if you will, right? The B2B being, we selected these 50 plus organizations who we thought were best in class. And as you alluded to earlier, giving them, yes, financial resources, yes, tech resources, yes, Google talent in the form of volunteers who would help them, but really leveraging, frankly, the strength of our brand to help legitimize and build momentum behind these tech hubs in these new emerging markets. It was a great chapter of work. And the people who run them are all, it's like bringing together a summer camp, right? Just the DNA across these community builders globally is pretty magical.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I remember when Google Campus London opened, maybe it was 2011 or 12. I can't remember the exact time. 2012. It was as I was moving back to London. So I grew up in London, and I remember just being so excited. It was just such a cool, and for people who don't know, Google Campus was a place where it was like not a Google office. It was a community building, I guess, or like a kind of like a co-working space, but there were events every single day. It was kind of like WeWork merged with Google Office and a community hub is how I would describe it. That's probably a terrible description, but it was really, really fun, and we would kind of volunteer and try to help out. And also we would be learning a ton from the startups, and it was just an amazing community. So I remember that kind of buzz and excitement. But that was in London, and then eventually the US, which are the developed markets of the West. You mentioned earlier that your family came from Thailand as immigrants. My family were Pakistani immigrants. So I'm assuming, similar to me, you've had some more exposure to outside of just the US and Europe, especially given your job. So I'm curious, are there kind of some stories or people that you remember from your travels and kind of like what they were working on, and where you said, oh, wow, this really surprised me. I didn't think that someone in Pakistan or Thailand or wherever would be working on this. I'm just curious if anything comes to mind.
Yes, I mean, the privilege of working and looking across these markets, a few things. One, there are so many more similarities across ecosystems, regardless of the country's state of economic development than you would expect. And it's really exciting to go deep on. Last month, I was judging a pitch competition in Asia across, I think it was across 11 markets. And, I within our firm, I specialize in health tech investing. And so it happened to be a ton of health tech companies who are pitching, but their solution, I mean, their target market is, if they launch in their home country, it's 1 billion users that they have immediate access to. And so the scale at which these international markets, in emerging markets can operate at from day one is really exciting. But the biggest lesson to me was, this concept that within Google, we talked about constraint breeds creativity. The same applies to all early stage startups of, well, you have to bootstrap, you're usually forced to. But some of the most innovative solutions I saw came from in very emerging markets where there simply was no other option, or you're solving a tangible problem. I mean, you work with Charity Water, for example, right? Some of these are life and death situations where, well, we have to use technology somehow to innovate. And so I had spent a lot of time before we started Google for Entrepreneurs, Google for Startups, in working on Central Asia, Middle East. We had an effort within Google that was called the Bottom 20 internally, which was the 20 least connected countries in the world from an access perspective. And could we, send in a cross-functional team for a week or so, meet as many potential partner organizations as we could, come home and launch products and partnerships. And that was such an exciting chapter, but really opened my eyes towards, wow, such amazing solutions. And so, and you mentioned, your family is from Pakistan. One of my favorite people in the world is a woman named Jahan Ara. I don't know if you know her.
I've definitely heard the name, and I think I heard you gave a talk and mentioned her as well. So in prep for this, I heard her name.
She is one to watch. But I met her literally a decade ago this year, on a Google trip there, and just the notion that she was building a physical space for the community, but also building the online content and building just really a pioneer in her ecosystem around supporting the next generation. Now, those companies have gone on to do extraordinarily well. That's just an example of, you think about the community builders here within the US, but they're in almost every market. I'm from Thailand, so my a space that I love there is called Hubba, which is a space there in Bangkok. Anywhere you go, I would encourage you just look for the landing pad, which was what Campus London was hoping, endeavored to be in that earliest day. And it'll be interesting to see how things evolve, right, in the post-COVID world, because phase one a decade ago taught us that there is something that's paramount about physical space, something that you cannot replace that in-person connection, while we can leverage a ton virtually. And I'm a firm believer in that. And I hope that, we'll find ways to collaborate online and offline.
Yeah, 100%. So one thing that I've thought quite a lot about, especially seeing the scale from inside of Google, especially when you could literally see anything, right? Like early on, I think over time they had to restrict some stuff because it was getting too many people, but you could subscribe to any newsletter, like an internal newsletter where people were sharing. The one that comes to mind for me was Android. I remember it going from 4% to 80% market share, and every week I would get an email from the team saying, and I didn't work on this, right? I was just like a curious Google employee, and I would see, oh, we're doing partnerships with Vodafone here, and we're doing this kind of distribution deal in Asia, and all these sorts of things. And for me, that was one of the big benefits of working at a company at that scale, even if you're not directly working on it. And one of the things that always stood out to me was just the scale of people that didn't have access to the internet. And in 2021, from the latest numbers I saw, there's about 4.6 billion people who do have internet access. When you were starting Google for Entrepreneurs, it was probably closer to 2 billion or something like that. But if you just think about that, whoever's listening right now, right, that's only 65% of the world, roughly. And that means there's still a huge chunk of the world that doesn't have just the most basic access to the internet, plus phones, plus all the infrastructure that's being built right now. And the cool thing that we're seeing is that in a lot of these countries that are developing so quickly, they're just skipping a whole layer of infrastructure and going straight to mobile, or they don't have to deal with this legacy financial system. They're just building straight up on the new things that are already there. So as we kind of transition the conversation to investing, and one of your big parts of your thesis is investing outside of just the coasts. I don't know if that includes international startups as well, but I'm curious, like, as you think about your thesis as investing in the future that you kind of want to see in the world, what does that look like to you from a global perspective?
Yes. So I would say my lens, because of my background, my lens is always, how differentiated of a solution is this? And is this a solution that scales globally, right? Even if, yes, we have to have some initial target markets to launch in, but is this truly transformative in that way? And in the way that the vision for Android, right, to your question of how do we close this gap of access, it's just the concept of we're going to build a great mobile operating system and open source it. I mean, that kind of one question that my partner, Bread and Butter, Brett, his favorite question to ask entrepreneurs when we meet is, how are you going to take over the world? And it's half joking, but 100% serious, which is, invitation to tell us your big vision at that 10,000 foot view of how this is going to transform the industry. And so I guess just to tell you how I ended up where I am now. So we had talked about, I was at Revolution, which was a fantastic chapter and really an amazing platform to raise the visibility of what's happening between the coasts. It also helped enable me to be here in Minnesota. And after a couple of years in this market, really getting to know the home base, the new home base, my family and my husband and I made the decision very volitionally that we are here to stay and we want to go long for this strategy. And really, to me, that meant, for my husband, that meant he went to work in the governor's cabinet, working on, the public sector side. For me, it was, I have the entrepreneurial bug. I know that I want to continue the work of early stage investing, but I want to do that from and in the community that I'm now a part of. And so in 2020, I teamed up with Brett Broll, who's a local investor here in town. He's a super deep in the food tech and ag tech vertical, just a really seasoned entrepreneur and a great investor. And he had his own solo GP fund, which was called the Syndicate Fund. And so in 2020, we decided to partner up, and then we rebranded the Syndicate Fund into Bread and Butter, and are now building that next chapter, the next fund, the next, set of, we hope, world-changing companies. And so the thesis for Bread and Butter specifically is actually very predicated on place. And that place is Minnesota. So I'm coming to you today from Minneapolis, where I now live. And the thesis is, let's back the best companies in the world, anywhere in the world, but specifically tie back to our home base, both from a sector perspective, and then equally important, how we support them after we invest. And so, many of you may not know a lot about Minnesota. I knew much less prior to moving here. It's really a special place as far as we have among the highest number of Fortune 500 companies per capita in the US, 16 Fortune 500s are based here. We're truly at the epicenter of these multi-trillion-dollar global industries, which include, food tech, health tech, enterprise SaaS, a big enterprise in general. FinTech is very emerging here. And so our thesis is to put forward 3 core verticals, and you can roughly think of it as, we think of it as the bread and butter sectors of the modern economy.
I love the name, by the way. It fits in so many different layers.
Thank you. It's a nod to one of the nicknames for the state of Minnesota, the bread and butter state. But, briefly, it's how we feed ourselves, how we care for one another, and how we work. So food tech, health tech, enterprise software are the big 3. And then we've gone and really leaned in to work closely with those companies in our backyard. So companies that include, Ecolab, Cargill, General Mills, Schwann's Food Company, Hormel, United Health Group, Mayo Clinic, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Target, 3M, US Bank, TCF Bank. I could go on about what Minnesota has going on for us here. And the idea is to work with these titans of industry to help them better access the emerging tech startups in their verticals, and everything from help us get smarter about the market, help us in our diligence, but more importantly, help facilitate commercial introductions for companies, help facilitate co-investment opportunities. Long term, we hope to create this virtuous flywheel of exits and companies that can start, grow, scale right here, because we really have just a tremendous set of resources in the backyard.
Yeah, you mentioned before around like we're in 2021 where we've all been forced to work. Well, people who are able to work from home for the last year have been doing so. And I feel like a lot of people have said we fast forwarded a trend that was already happening, which was remote work, distributed work. And we could spend an hour just discussing the pros and cons of in-person versus remote work. And my general take is there's benefits to each. I think we're probably going to move to a world where more remote work happens, but there's still stuff that happens in person. And like your background with, community and business development, that sort of stuff happens in person at an accelerated rate for a reason. But that doesn't mean you can't use remote work to accelerate that and scale yourself. But I'm curious, as you invest, how are you thinking about those companies as a day one distributed company versus being in your local state or even just local markets? How are you thinking about the future of work in that way?
Well, I'll tell you, Bilal, I think the future is here, right? It's arrived. And because of our backgrounds operationally at Google, we were probably on the extreme end of being comfortable with distributed teams already. But we saw the industry, as you say, has a leapfrog toward that. And now, we're in an incredibly competitive environment for talent for early stage companies. And it's the new norm that we see. We're comfortable investing remotely, but two, we're comfortable investing in remote first or distributed teams. And that's been the case I'm trying to think of exceptions to that rule. The majority of investments we've made in the last year, which include over a dozen investments, are in distributed teams. And I think with the right proactive culture put in place, in the early days, and it can work really, really well. And it's actually an advantage. I was working with a company recently who is co-located in 2 time zones. And, the final candidate they were interviewing was on the West Coast. And we had the conversation about, well, is this going to be a challenge? Because now the company will be in, 8 time zones versus 3 versus 5. But my immediate thought was, well, it's going to be an advantage to have somebody on the West Coast. And ultimately, you're going to end up running a team from California to Asia and back again, just a matter of when. And let's just build it that way from the ground up. If you think this is the right candidate and the right time. And so I do believe that investors, by and large, are getting very comfortable. And if you're not, you're going to have to.
May get left behind. Yeah. Well, even if I'm thinking of people I listen to on the podcast circuit, like Jason Calacanis, This Week in Startups, he's has his podcast to get Dealflow pretty much and to promote, different people. And even I've heard him speak about recently how we've seen the exodus of people move from New York and San Francisco to places like Austin and Miami. But I think that's like a very specific group of people going to specific places. But I think just the wider trend of moving to, places like Minnesota, or even moving regions completely, or going to Europe, or even splitting time. Like I'd done that for the last few years before COVID. I was spending 2 months in Argentina and then Mexico City and avoiding the New York cold and stuff like that. So I'm hoping that more people are able to do that going forward. You mentioned some of the sectors that you're kind of, or the focuses of your fund. So you said health tech, restaurant tech, I think you said, right?
Food tech.
Food tech. and software or SaaS, I think you said. So could you go into that a little bit more? Why is it that you focus on these areas? Is that because of the strength in your region and ties to other companies, or is it just something that you've seen a unique opportunity in?
Yeah, so it's twofold. One is just the background, the investing background that Brett and I bring to the fund. And so that's a great overlap there. And then secondly is that, as again, that place, that Minnesota home field advantage of we really are sitting at the epicenter of the titans, the corporate leaders in those sectors. And so let's build a thesis that leverages that resource. And so that's why we prioritize those big three. And to give you a bit of a drill down quickly on each. So food tech to us represents, we invest in the software and tech-enabled hardware side of food tech, which is to say we don't invest specifically in CPG food products, but it's all about everything from think about on-farm supply chain, manufacturing, distribution, robotics is a huge interest, some biotech, all the way through to the future of food retail and how food gets delivered to the end consumer. And so it's a really interesting vertical, which I think, there's underinvestment in by and large. A lot of firms do look at food, but specifically this food tech, we like to think of it as, really about 11 years ago was the creation of the modern era of food tech investing, which is when Monsanto acquired a company called Climate Corp for over $1 billion. And it was like, hey, you could have venture style exits in this sector. And so the COVID crisis has really exposed a lot of vulnerabilities in these areas. And so I think it'll only become more important than ever. So that's our first vertical, which, I'm really excited about. Our second vertical is digital health. So specifically the software and tech-enabled hardware side of health. So we don't focus on medical devices and pharma, not because they aren't super interesting, but funds of our stage and size, I think are well capitalized to play in digital. And so that's everything from, leaning heavily into these themes around value-based care, looking at solutions that target very large but segmented parts of the population. So we've done 4 investments in the last few quarters, 2 in the female health space, 1 in the elder care aging space, and then 1 that's a company called River Health that's building, low cost, accessible healthcare plans for people who don't have access to insurance. And so a lot of exciting things to come, but I am, my head is spinning in the best of ways, just having conversations with some of the local giant players, and you start to hear the recurring themes of where the gaps are, where the industries are headed. And then enterprise SaaS is our third vertical. And that's, broadly speaking, the future of work, B2B companies. We've got a range there, 2 examples to make it more tangible. One is a company based in Minnesota called Fulcrum, and Fulcrum is building cloud-based ERP software for manufacturing. Think about, trying to modernize the analog industry and to make it, bring them forward into the digital age. The other is a topic du jour. It's a company called TechMate, and they're building a national platform that's for, remote IT support. So the use case would be companies like Google who have remote workers in 25 cities, can contract with a national partner for a consistent standard of excellence and service. And so a couple examples, but these are themes and trends and industries that have been around well beyond the pandemic, since before the pandemic, but we just feel like it's accelerated the pace of innovation. Our own pace of investing has accelerated, and there's just a lot to be excited about right now.
That's awesome. Thanks for that breakdown. I think that when you just mentioned the kind of manual processes, and I just thought of like clipboards and fax machines, which to a lot of people sounds like, what are you talking about? Who's using that? But trust me, there's plenty of people in lots of industries still using fax machines and clipboards, and those aren't always the sexiest industries, but they're the ones that have huge upside potential for essentially applying software principles that we already know work elsewhere and bringing them to these kind of areas. So one of the questions I have on investing side is really about I'll get to the learning how to be a good investor in a second, but I'm kind of intrigued by this idea of the solo capitalist, small investing teams. There's even this like the creator economy is developing all these individuals who have maybe like built an audience through podcasting, Twitter, email newsletters that are then taking their expertise and their leverage essentially with an audience and investing in startups. So one example is Harry Stebbings from 20 Minute VC or 20 VC, whatever it's called nowadays, fellow Brit. He just raised a $140 million fund after doing 1,000+ interviews on his podcast when he was 16 years old or something like that. And he's just one example. I do another podcast called Not Investment Advice with a friend of mine called Jack Butcher, who started Visualize Value, and Trung Phan, who is a lead writer at the Hustle newsletter. Those two are both... Oh, say that again?
You're busy.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot of microphone work nowadays. But yeah, so on that podcast, those two, we're just kind of riffing on the week's news and stuff going on the edge of the internet. But Jack has been investing in quite a lot of startups on the side, just because people are coming to him and saying, you've got unique value, you've built something from scratch, you've got hundreds of thousands of people that follow you. Why don't you kind of like invest, but also help us figure out communicating our ideas in a simple way? So I'm curious, like, first of all, what you think about that kind of emerging world.
It's a great time. There's so many new fund managers or emerging managers, and the industry is beginning to really open up. And it's such a to date has been a closed network industry, right? And it's exciting and refreshing to see new faces and new players who bring new approaches and different backgrounds. Ultimately, it really comes down to there's two sides of the pancake or of the business, right? Which is, one is you are identifying, backing, and supporting operationally some great entrepreneurs. And that's, to me, that's where my heart has come from. I consider myself, I'm a techie at heart. Then the other very real side of the business is you're a fund manager. It sounds obvious, but it's the raising of the capital, the managing relationships with LPs, you are a money manager. And that's the business side of what makes it flow. And so it's keeping in mind both of those responsibilities. I think people from very different backgrounds can come into that role. So I'm in general a fan of, yes, there has to be some direct applicability to ideally both those sides of the business, but it's a question of, who's getting backing from LPs. And one very viable path absolutely is build an audience for yourself, build a thought, your thought leadership, put it out there. And I am hopeful because I do believe that as we see different fund managers emerge and just more diversity in every sense of the word, that also flows down immediately right into who's getting funding as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. No, and people who listen to the show regularly know I'm generally a fan of this space. I think a lot of the big VCs have the area they call the creator economy that they're investing in. And to me, this is an extension of that. It's not necessarily building the tools for podcasters and YouTubers, but it's essentially leveraging their expertise and networks. Like Jack doesn't know a lot about most things, but he knows a lot more than most about his world. And I think he's a great example of someone who can, continue adding value from that point of view. Similar to Pomp, who's also been on the show. He's been really big into crypto for years and built a name for himself. And now he has invested $100 million in startups in that world. So I guess selfishly, since I've got you here and you are an expert in this by now, I guess I would ask the question, if someone like me, let's say I'm a complete amateur really in real startup investing, but let's say in 5 to 10 years, I'd say, I really like startups. I can add some value through my background, my network, my knowledge of growing companies. And then hopefully also from the stuff I've been building on here. Let's say someone like me or someone listening like me wanted to learn how to be a good investor with startups specifically. What does that kind of curriculum look like to you, whether that's books, podcasts, doing the work, or anything else that's really helped you?
It's a great question. I think the best way to learn is to dive in and start doing and start building. Yes, I'm a big consumer of content and I love to read and listen and learn that way. But I think the best way is, what does that playbook look like? While there's every investor you talk to will tell you there's no singular linear path into venture. It was all twists and turns. A few of the key skills that I believe. So one is developing your point of view and your thesis, and that can be honed in a number of ways, right? If your expertise now is in the creator economy, that's a strong, clear point of view. For me, I've always been, my personality, my intellectual curiosity is very generalist, which suits well to generalist investing. In new business development, it was we work with every single Google product area. Every month we're pivoting to go deep in a different space. It's an intellectually just so curious role. So developing your thesis and point of view is one, and that's over the years, what background, skill sets, experiences do you bring that gives you credibility and a unique point of view there? So that's one. Two is building ultimately that community around you of people you've worked with, worked for, come to know. How are you going to effectively source deal flow? To me, the biggest factor and what I hope is going to be, major success in investing is being able to pick from great deal flow. And so we are 100% focused on inbound as well as outbound. So, at Bread and Butter, we're very forward leaning into, for example, every member of our team does open office hours every week. You can book them on our website. We get a lot of great unsolicited inbound from that, right? We get a lot of referrals we have about 400 firms in our network who we have active relationships with and source a lot back and forth through that. But it's very important to me that we always have an open door policy where it's not just a warm intro. That said, introductions are an important source as well. So building both on the front end, but then on the back end, after you invest, how are you going to add value? And so that goes back to that set of relationships too. And then that third piece to me is that operational piece of what makes you a good investor beyond the dollar and beyond your ability to hopefully pick great winners, is how you can support them day in and day out. And it could be something either very specific or maybe something non-obvious. So a specific example is Stephanie Rich on our team is our head of platform, and she's absolutely amazing entrepreneur by background. She also is a journalist by background. And so one of her superpowers is bringing that PR lens to early stage companies, right? So helping them literally draft their press releases, do the pitching, figure out how to scale the work internally, brand exercises with them. So that can be very specialized, or it can be more general, like Brett on our team, built and ran 4 companies. I didn't mean to say small because, he's two successful exits. One, he jokes he ran into a brick wall and probably learned the most from. But the operational day-to-day of actually starting and rinsing and repeating is a superpower that I think is hard to quantify. So
definitely,
those are the big areas.
Yeah, and just you mentioned a few of your team. What does your team look like, by the way? And what's the kind of structure in a firm like yours?
So that literally is our team. And so we're a team of 3. So Brett Brohl and I are the 2 general partners. And then Steph Rich is our head of platform. And so the way we work day to day, Brett leads our food tech practice. I lead our health tech practice. We both team up on enterprise SaaS. We can and do a little bit outside of those zones, but that's by and large the majority of the sectors we focus on. And then Stephanie, with head of platform, is building out, especially for seed stage, it's less common, I feel like, to have a fully dedicated platform function. And so we're really proud of that component of the work, but it's everything from our experts network to LP network to educational resources, the product perks, the corporate network that I spoke about earlier. So it's a lot of fun. It's very entrepreneurial. We're a startup.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I'm curious. You mentioned doing a dozen deals or so, I think you said, in the last year. Is that right?
At least a dozen. I have to do a fully accurate count, but I'd say about 15.
Yeah, so 15, just to paint a picture for people, like the funnel to get to 12 investments or 15 investments, sorry. How many people would you have to see / have meetings with to get all the way down to that? level of due diligence to actually invest. Because I'm trying to paint a picture for people who are interested in this space, like what actually happens day to day and the kind of work that goes into this, because I know there's a ton of work involved.
It's a great question. So across the team, across the three of us, we collectively see north of 1,500 deals a year. And that's the majority of that is inbound. And so I talked about the co-investor network, the accelerator network. It's our, some of our personal, where we've spent time, Brett managed, built the Techstars farm to fork food tech program. Through my work at Google, we get a lot of referrals from all corners of the world. So that's, I'd say 70+% of that is inbound via that network. The remainder comes from entrepreneur referrals, both founders we've invested in, founders we have not invested in as well. Then we've got a lot of just time in the community, right? Time spent either in person, these days virtually. It's been very easy. We probably do at least one event per week across the team. And then the office hours that I talked about. And we just closed our first investment into a company that we met through open office hours. And so it does.
That's awesome.
It does work. And to anyone listening, I encourage you to find those open doors because it does work.
That's awesome. And the last question I have for you is, because I know coming from your background with the global lens, you guys have really focused on driving more inclusion and diversity in your approach and being quite proactive about that, which I know nowadays is every company says they're focused on that, but some companies are better than others at doing that. So I'm curious, first of all, if you could just share a little bit about your approach to that and how maybe other people could learn from your proactive approach.
Yes, I mean, I could talk all day on this topic. I think it's such a prominent topic of conversation, but it has been such a deeply embedded problem where we think about diversifying will require change at every layer of the stack within our industry, from who are the LPs putting capital to work in the funds, who are the GPs making the investment decisions and writing the checks, what companies are in the pipeline that we're investing in. And then from there, who are those companies bringing on board their management teams, who's on the cap table, who's on their board, right? So thinking about every layer of the stack, how do we help be a part of, driving the change forward? And so just from a statistics perspective, so in our first two funds, we have 42 portfolio companies. Of those, 46% are led by a female founder, co-founder. And then of those, 63% of those companies include a founder who's a person of color. And so, I'm proud of the progress that we're making. We don't have any quotas or anything like that. It is a direct function of a few things. One is having a more diverse team in general, right? We're 2/3 female. We attract it. I think it's a market signal that this firm is open for business to everyone. And the second is having the proactive sourcing strategies that I mentioned, which frankly aren't even that proactive. They're the easiest thing possible, right? It's allow open Calendly links on your calendar for certain chunks of the week and allow companies to self-select, sign up and pitch to you. But when you're thinking about raising your fund as well, right? How to target diversifying your LP base. And that's a challenge because ultimately, changes, it takes time, but I think that's a big part of it as well to me, is seeing representation in who's investing in us as well.
That's a good point about the LP side. I haven't really thought as much about that, because normally when you think of the equation, you're thinking what's front facing, the entrepreneurs you're backing, even your team and the exec team, like you said, of those companies, people they hire. But the LP side, because they're often kind of silent people in the background, right? Like, for people who don't know, those are the people who are investing in your fund that you're then redeploying some of those funds to startups, right? So, why could you go into a little bit more detail around that? Why is that so important to you in that kind of overall flow?
Well, I think that it's foundational to seeing the change in the industry overall, especially with institutional LPs or limited partners. And these are institutions, foundations, corporations, family offices, pension funds, who are writing large checks into funds versus individual investors who maybe are writing smaller checks. And I've recently been a part of conversations with foundations who are institutional investors into venture firms. And it's been really exciting because at a specific foundation, the conversation was around, and they're investing for financial return. This is not philanthropy, right? And the question was, well, we have X million dollars to deploy into this asset class, but we're only going to back firms who care about diversity on their team. And maybe we'll invest in their first fund because they're not a diverse team yet, but they've committed, it's important to them. But by the time that next fund rolls around to re-up our investment, if progress hasn't been made, they're not going to renew that investment. And I've seen that in practice, which is just an example of, well, there's two ways to drive change. One is to back new teams, new managers that are already diverse. And the second is to incentivize current teams to think about diversifying because, ultimately we all believe it's going to drive better decision-making and better financial return. So those are some of the levers that we can pull.
Got it. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I didn't really think of it from that side. Well, listen, we've covered so much today, and you've been awesome to speak to, and I'm glad we finally got to meet in person, in air quotes, or face-to-face in air quotes. Is there anything else you want to cover off, or a message for people where people can learn more and follow your work?
Sure. Well, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. I've been such a big fan of your show, Bilal. So thank you for having me. Where you can find us online, we're breadandbutterventures.com. I did mention the open office hours, which you can find there on our website on the community page. I would love to meet more of you. We're on Twitter at breadbuttervc. And we also blog regularly on our Medium page. So would love to hear from you. We are actively, always looking for great entrepreneurs, great partners, great organizations to work with. That's amazing. Well, I'd love to do this again in the future. And hopefully when you're in New York next, or if I ever make it to Minnesota, we'll go and say hello as well. Absolutely. I love New York's one of my very favorite cities. So hopefully I'll be out there before too long. Awesome. Well, thanks again. And again, if you're listening to this for the first time, go check out the website. We shared it on the screen as well and in the show notes. And let us know what you think of this on Twitter. I'm at B80. Do you use Twitter much or not really? I do. I'm at Mary Grove. At Mary Grove. Perfect. Let us know what you think of this. And I'll see you next time. Thank you so much. Well, I'll take care.